the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name is Annie, and I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which is an independent bookstore based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You're watching one of our virtual author events. Thank you for being here. If it's your first virtual event with Majors and Quinn, welcome. If it's not, welcome back. Thank you so much for your support of this program. I'm pleased tonight to present a conversation between Dr. Sara Kamali and Alex Reid Ross, PhD. They'll be discussing Sara's new book, Homegrown Hate, which is why white nationalists and militant Islamists are waging war against the United States. And you'll be hearing a little bit from that book, but also a conversation between these two. And there will be a chance for asking your own questions. We will do an audience Q&A at the end of the hour. I'll be moderating that. If you're watching on Facebook, please put your questions in the comments section underneath this video. If you're watching on YouTube, please put your questions in the chat function and we can see them here. Also, you can use that function to just say hello, let us know where you're watching from. And I will also be placing a link directly to the book on the Majors and Quinn website in there as well, so you can check it out if you so wish. So let me introduce our two speakers this evening. Dr. Sara Kamali is a senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. She's a holistic justice activist and a scholar of systemic inequities, white nationalism, and militant Islamism. Her work examines how interlocking institutions of power oppress the many while maintaining systems of privilege for a select few. Sara, thank you so much for being here. And Alexander Reid Ross, PhD, is an adjunct professor at the Portland State University Department of Geography and holds fellowships at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, Political Research Associates, and the Network Contagion Research Institute. His book, Against the Fascist Creep, was named one of the best books of 2017 by the Portland Mercury, and his articles on the far right have been featured in peer-reviewed publications such as Oregon Historical Quarterly and the Journal of Social Justice. I'm so looking forward to hearing your conversation, the both of you. I will be back later to take questions. And until then, have a wonderful time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annie. And I also want to thank Majors and Quinn, a wonderful bookstore in Minneapolis. Thank you for facilitating the event as well as hosting. And I'd like to take the opportunity. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Minneapolis and the current events that are going on right now. With specifically to do with law enforcement and policing, as well as the broader dynamics of racial inequity that have long been affecting and impacting Minneapolis, as well as, of course, the United States. So I wanted to bring your attention to the Mapping Prejudice Project out of the University of Minnesota that's doing such a great job in terms of detailing the racial covenants that have restricted housing for a long time within the region itself, and as well as speaking to the legacy of skin color oppression and the history of redlining within the United States. And as we know, that one zip code really determines the trajectory of the benefits and privileges that one is afforded throughout one's life, as well as the fact that housing is the quickest way to build wealth, as well as generational wealth, which is, of course, impacting and detrimental to and essentially creating what we know now as the racial wealth gap. And also, of course, Minneapolis and Minnesota are the sites of the last years of George Floyd's life, as well as his murder, and now the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, and most recently, the tragic and devastating and unnecessary death of Daunte Wright in Brooklyn Center, which is only 10 miles away, as many of you know, from Minneapolis. So the reason I'm talking about this now is because Homegrown Hate touches upon and discusses at length how race is a concept that is a fallacy, but how racism is a violent reality. So I'm looking forward to this talk with Dr. Ross, with Alex, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be able to, be a discussant here. So thank you to the bookstore. Thank you, Annie, and thank you, Dr. Kamali, for inviting me. So your book, Homegrown Hate, I found it really informative, super informative. I tend to, digest facts like a sponge, and your book had so much in it that I was, impressed by. Just for the fact that I kind of specialize in a lot of this stuff, and just a lot of it was new to me. So I definitely think everybody from experts to the lay uh, audience will have a really good time reading the book and learning from it. And one thing that I was really particularly interested in was the extent to which you could articulate these definitions in ways that I thought were refreshing and really kind of on point. So I wanted to ask if you could just, for the audience, go over your definitions of white nationalism as opposed to white supremacy, and how they relate to one another, how they're kind of different in their own ways.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. Um, so white supremacy is the idea that whiteness itself is biologically superior to other skin colors, and essentially that will white supremacy breaks the world up into races. Um, and this idea that whiteness itself is superior can be biologically based. It also can be based on an understanding of religion, not just Christianity specifically, but also what I call racist religions, like Odinism, as well as other religions that are somewhat more in the um, minority in terms of numbers of adherents, such as creativity and cosmotheism. So there also can be an amalgamation of, well, I believe in white supremacy and white is right. That idea that's not only based on a certain understanding of a religion, but also an understanding of biology. Um, and then the natural extension of white supremacy is white nationalism. And that's why as you kindly pointed out, take pains to differentiate these terms in the book, because I think oftentimes we will speak about white supremacy when we're very often talking about white nationalism. And white nationalism is the idea that there should be an ethno state, a territory specifically for white people and whomever is deemed white. Whiteness is a fluid category, as histories of many countries, including the United States, has shown us. For example, Southern Europeans, specifically Italians, as well as Irish, for example, uh, uh, when they've immigrated here, they were not considered white. So the ideas of whiteness have changed over time, but essentially, white nationalism is the idea that white people only belong in power. There should be a white ethno state. Now, what that means for everybody considered non-white is up to interpretation. So it can be that white people are completely eliminated, or that they're subjugated to be part of a subcaste, essentially second class. I wouldn't even say citizens, but in terms of being supporting, or not supporting, but essentially in terms of what we've seen over centuries of enslavement. So there's this idea that in white supremacy and the natural extension of white nationalism, that anybody who's deemed non-white is not worthy essentially of the same advantages, benefits, and opportunities as those who are deemed to be white. Dr. Ross, are you there?
So I think that that's really interesting and on point, especially in the context of your book and what you're talking about in terms of a natural extension there. There was a recent study that was published in the Washington Post and the New York Times about demographic change, and how the participants in January 6th riot, insurrection, or what have you, were largely from counties that had experienced a sharper demographic change, whereby white, ethnic and racial people were sort of losing that majority foothold in those counties. And this sort of reaction on January 6th might be seen as a kind of a racial reaction, a reaction of racial alienation, which you talk about in your book. So I was wondering if you could kind of get into that a little bit, like how is racial alienation contributing to white supremacy?
So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's racial alienation. I would say that there is an idea that there is a threat posed by everybody deemed to be non-white to white. So from the worldview, from the stance of white nationalists specifically, there's this idea that everybody else, the other people of color, etc., are going to pose a very real threat to the very existence of white people. And that narrative of victimhood is what justifies violence. And so that specific study by Robert Pape essentially argues and found that it was not economic anxiety that drove many many of the people who participated in the January 6th insurrection. It's this idea of essentially what I call white genocide. So, chapter 3 is entitled White Genocide for a reason, and that's because this idea that white identity itself is under attack, whether through sheer numbers and demographic changes of people of color becoming the majority, as very real projections have shown, or and the idea that white culture essentially is under attack because of immigration, because of diversity, because of initiatives like critical race theory being taught in schools, because of things like ethnic studies, for example. There's this idea that whiteness must be protected, and that the Great Replacement Theory, for example, is the title of a manifesto. It's also the title of a book in concept that has been decades long within the canon of white nationalist ideology in the United States, as well as shared many times, through social media, for example, and through different publications around the world. So white nationalism, this idea that there's this white genocide happening that warrants violence, is very much a transnational concept. And then just the last point on that, just for the viewers who want to know, there is also this what has essentially become the motto of white nationalists, and the very idea which is predicated upon this theory of the Great Replacement. It's called the 14 Words, and it was penned by an Odinist. His name's David Lane, and he's essentially one of the preeminent white nationalists in American history, and his ideas and his very prolific writings have shaped the canon of white nationalist ideology. And the 14 Words is now essentially a catchphrase that really underpins this sense of victimhood, as well as the need and justifications for violence. So the 14 Words is: we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So that speaks to the need for self-defense, as well as the need for essentially to multiply and use women as vessels, as very often is cited in literature, as well as this concept of the Great Replacement that has, and this white anxiety essentially that has fueled January 6th, as well as so many decades of white nationalist violence in this country and around the world.
Yeah, so on that Great Replacement theme, I was wondering if we could drill down a little bit more, because that's a really hot button kind of thing right now, with Tucker Carlson basically repeating it, and then doubling down on it, right? So fascists tend to create, or excuse me, I'll go with far right because this is more kind of broad. So more broadly, the far right tends to create and exploit emotional states like you're talking about, angst and despair, And it feels like great replacement theory is like right out ahead of that. So, you talked a little bit about that, but can you really kind of explain what that is and how it relates to that racial anxiety that you're talking about? I mean, um, I just, you know, and the normalization of it, right? What is the normalization of it doing to our country?
The normalization of the idea of being replaced, essentially.
Right.
So there have been, well, actually, before we start, I'm happy to answer the question, but what do you see as the difference between fascism and the far right, and how would you differentiate that, and how do you in your own work?
So in my work, I think of fascism as a specific kind of both a historical trajectory, in terms of like a genealogy of movements, right? So you have fascism with a big F with Mussolini, and then him kind of getting into power, and the demonstration effect whereby different groups start calling themselves fascist. So there's this fascistization process where fascism becomes a brand, but really fascism also has an ideological core, in my opinion, which I get from what's called the new consensus. Effectively, that fascism is a specific kind of palingenetic ultranationalism. So it focuses on a rebirth of a kind of a mythical past, and you know deploys that towards patriarchy and in almost every case a sort of single party totalitarian quasi populism. But the far right is far more broad than that. I think of the far right as a part of the right wing, so it generally rejects equality as its sort of premise for organizing, and it deploys authoritarianism, right? So the far right is the authoritarian sort of end of the right wing. So you get the things like nativism in their strongest form there, and you also tend to get populism, and conspiracy theories popping up there as well. So in general,
Mhm.
I think of the far right as an umbrella between the radical right and the extreme right.
Hmm. Okay, so we have slightly different takes on the far right, but yeah, of course, it's more of a. I mean, I think we agree on the fact that it is a broader umbrella term. So anyway, that's that. Thank you so much for that. I think it's always interesting in terms of how people choose to define things because it very much shapes how we understand them. Okay, going back to the Great Replacement Theory. So, uh, Great Replacement Theory is essentially in the present day can be rooted in what I said earlier as a reality. And the reason I'm saying that is because very often, given the political dynamics of today, um, people tend to be very dismissive of other people's ideas if they don't necessarily agree with one's own ideas. So, what's important to understand about the sense of white, the concept of white identity, white genocide, excuse me, white genocide that feeds into the Great Replacement Theory, or that is supported by the Great Replacement Theory, is that the demographics of the United States specifically are shifting. And so there are projections that by 2050, the historically marginalized people who are people of color across the different communities of color within the United States are in fact going to be the majority. So there's a term majority minority for this reason. The Great Replacement Theory is essentially saying that people of color will overtake white people in terms of numbers as well as all different types of institutions and in terms of power dynamics, which then reifies the view of white nationalists that white identity is something that needs protecting, going back to not only the 14 words but again the underlying notion that there is a narrative of victimhood, which I discuss in detail in the book, as well as the need for violence in order to protect the biology of whiteness as well as the cultural components of whiteness. So this is part and parcel, I think, of the founding of the United States, and something that is a constant and has, I think, now being discussed because we are just seen it recently with Tucker Carlson's um, speech or take on pointing out essentially what was the Great Replacement theory, and decrying essentially as well cancel culture recently. What did you have you seen the clip? What did you think about it?
I think it was pretty standard kind of white nationalism, just right there on Fox News, right? And it's nothing it's nothing that surprises me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that kind of stuff from Tucker Carlson ever since he got in there and started inveighing against gypsies in like the Northeast or something like that. He tends to isolate and focus on specific reactionary talking points that have more traction in Europe and in the core of that sort of weird intersection between the radical right and the extreme right that I call the fascist creep. And it seems like his sort of goal is to normalize it through a populist resurgence of the old America First committee style nationalism. So yeah, it didn't surprise me. It's what I expect, but I support, you know, the ADL and other groups calling for him to be let go, because I don't think that that kind of attitude is beneficial to the country whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it does lead me to my next question, if I may, which is about this kind of like interesting far right kind of tendency in terms of populism, and what I see as a sort of populist tendency to invent these conspiracy theories in order to sort of to capture the elites that they've sort of are waging war against in their minds. And so, you know, your book and your work also focuses on this kind of stuff pretty close in. You put it under the microscope, you analyze it really well. So I wanted to ask you, what role do conspiracy theories play into the ideology of white nationalism? And what are some groups that utilize conspiracy theories in such a way?
Hmm. So the way that I conceive of white nationalists in the book, and the way that I categorize them, are into four categories, and then I break down the groups per category essentially. And so it's not necessarily in any type of hierarchical order, but there are anti-government groups. There okay, so I should say elements rather than groups, but there's an anti-government element, there's a specific racist element, then there's the racial or racist theological component, and then there's a conspiracy theorist element. And as we've seen with QAnon, which was paralleling the development and rise of QAnon, paralleled with Trump's presidency, and now has become a transnational pseudo religion. The, the ideas of conspiracy theories really feed in and reinforce each other, of course, as you well know, that essentially really reinforces a lot of different types of ideologies that essentially demonize the other. And so there is no untangling of a conspiracy theory, there is no explaining away of a conspiracy theory, and there is no rationalizing away of a conspiracy theory. It's a very entrenched type of dynamic that adds a, mm, I think, exacerbates the polarization that we have in this country and around the world in terms of identity politics. And that's not to say that people, there are no such thing as former conspiracy theorists, but the notion that basically, QAnon, for example, is very much predicated upon anti-Semitism and components like the blood libel, for example, that really are specifically meant to pejoritize and minoritize Jewish people, for example. And that, in and of itself, even before QAnon, has been really intertwined with white nationalism and the concept of white nationalism around the world, religiously, politically, and scientific, based on eugenics even. So conspiracy theories themselves really play a very potent dynamic um, into the dynamics of white nationalism, as well as the proselytization that needs to go um, into garnering different groups. So it's a really interesting component, especially because we have with QAnon specifically the evangelical groups, white evangelicals specifically, who are very much overlapping with QAnon adherents. And then that dynamic is really leading into a lot of anti-vax movements, as we've seen currently. So it's, I think, adding a layer of complexity in terms of how to effectively counter and address the the, um, the white nationalism that we're seeing today. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I I think so. I think that's really really interesting and important take. I know some people see virtually all conspiracy theories as sort of emerging from that kind of anti-Semitic tendency in history, but linking QAnon with the old blood libel stuff, I mean, that is just so obvious to me now, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like staring you in the face. But wow, that makes a lot of sense. Um,
Well,
but
I mean, oh, sorry. The anti-Semitism isn't necessarily just, it's just one of many conspiracy theories, of course. And so it's really interesting because Islamophobia also plays a large part in terms of perpetuating this need for a white ethno state and the concept, the underlying ethos of the 14 words, which is securing the existence of white people specifically. And so it's really interesting in terms of just conspiracy theories specifically and how they reinforce the dynamics and the beliefs of white nationalists, as well as the narratives of self-victimhood, because essentially you can create any type of demonization in order to feed into the need for a white ethno state. So that's something I discuss in detail in the book. It's also something I think that makes white nationalism so entrenched within well, currently within politics, and I think that complicates things quite a bit. I'm sorry, you were saying something, and then of course I
no,
talked
no, no.
around.
Where you ended up there is exactly where I was going. With this kind of like normalization of white nationalism, just the extent to which QAnon grew and became popular, and the extent to which now the far right is trying to kind of go back and reconfigure the memory of how January 6th actually happened. Even if they're not sort of dyed in the wool Q people, they're still going back and saying, but come on, this was actually led by secret Antifa sleeper cells or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. So, I mean, even if Q itself, I don't know. Are they going away? Are they sticking around? It's an interesting question. But it seems that the right in general is just kind of trending with these kind of conspiracy theory positions. And I've had experiences with conspiracy theorists before, and they seem like, you might want to just laugh them off,
Mm-hmm.
but if they're given space to kind of grow and thrive, then they can become quite vicious, and they will absolutely control a subject if you let them, and that can have debilitating consequences on anybody who wants to report the truth, who wants to produce factual information, because you end up just getting deluged, and they'll try to destroy your reputation. So it's a really consequential and serious subject, and I'm glad that you're approaching it in this very lucid and rational way. It's really easy to see the merits of that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But okay, so I would like to go back to the overlap of um, QAnon specifically, as well as the Republican Party as we're seeing it, because I think that really plays into as well the normalization and the rewriting of history, essentially. Um, but before we do, can we please have your take, your own experiences on conspiracy theories? Because I think what's really interesting um, is that a lot of times these issues, whether they be police violence or whether they be the real world impacts and specific sets of violence that can emanate from conspiracy theories, for example, are very often set aside and seen as, well, that's somebody else who's dealing with it, until of course oneself is faced with these types of violence. So do you care to share what your own experiences are, and perhaps how you has that shaped your own understanding of how conspiracy theories have played out on within white nationalism, for example?
Well, I mean, there are so many. The thing about conspiracy theories, I think, is that they really kind of tend to stem from and play into this tendency to develop a populist movement, right? Because conspiracy, through the connotation of the meaning of the word, suggests that there's some kind of elite cabal, right, that is controlling things. And so anybody who is writing about conspiracy theories automatically, just de facto, is part of the elite cabal, right? Um, and so I've experienced this kind of thing, reporting about conspiracy theories about the white helmets in Syria, that this notion that they are terrorists who are planting bodies, or who are taking part in chemical weapon attacks and then framing the Assad regime and stuff like that. I've actually had articles retracted because this huge number of conspiracy theorists attacked me and threatened legal action for writing about their networks. So they can, if they're allowed to kind of fester in the mainstream, they can totally have a massive impact on a global scale. And I've been researching more about the Bosnian genocide and different ways that denial of real world atrocities can really alter the course of world events. And honestly, it's really scary. So obviously it's just really important to vet sources, not to be carried away with the allure of the inside track and the information that they don't want you to know and stuff like that. It's really important just to try and uh, stay as clear and focused, and try not to kind of move away into these sort of circles of suspicion and extreme skepticism.
Mm-hmm. Well, under what guise did they retract your articles, or what was the reason given, I should say, by the publication, by the editorial, um, by the editors of the outlets, I'm assuming?
So just one outlet. They were contrite, but they didn't really give a full explanation. They said that they could have worded things more clearly, but I think at the end of the day, there was an uproar that because I was showing how left and right were joining together in a conspiracy theory, um, I was actually accusing the left-wing people who were joining in with the right of being right-wingers.
Hmm.
And so that's why they pulled it back and they said, that's not what we were trying to do. We were trying to show that this is left joining with right. And then so they apologized to people who felt like they were wrongly accused of being right wingers. So it was a distortion of the point of my article, which was then fed back to get the piece retracted.
So given your own research as well as your own experiences with the real world implications of conspiracy theories, what are some elements, or how would you um, propose um, stemming conspiracy theories, or addressing how imbricated they've become within the political realm, and as well as just in terms of national discourse? As for example, we're very much seeing at the present moment with the anti-vax. Well, I wouldn't even say anti-vax. I would say anti coronavirus vaccine. So the anti-vax movement is a little predated the current pandemic, of course. But in terms of just the conspiracy elements of our current politics, or even, for example, there are so many people who believe that President Trump, was um, actually, indeed, in fact, uh, elected by the majority of people in 2020. So there are so many different conspiracy theories, and then somehow, like a daisy chain of rumors, they become um, embedded into our national consciousness, and questions then arise in terms of, well, so it really feeds into the whole disinformation elements, and the reality at present, that there seems to be no agreement on what actual reality is. So what are some proposals or perhaps thoughts you have in terms of either stemming conspiracy theories, or in terms of addressing them?
So I think that there are two main things. I think that a lot of conspiracy theories, they kind of do have a small kernel of truth to them. After the housing crisis, economic trends were that the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer. This seems to have been a long-term trend of stagnation in wages for the working class in the United States, if you will. And we need to be honest about that. We need to have honest conversations about class in the United States. Um, and and that needs to be open, right? And then, because if it's not, then you get all these other people saying, hey, did you know about this? And then, oh, I'll tell you the rest of the story, blood libel stuff. It's like,
Hmm.
it can be an open door when things are ignored in the public to go into that direction. With regards to other stuff like the corona virus vaccine conspiracy theories, a lot
Or
of
even
that
the
stuff.
origin, for example, of the pandemic. But yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that one's wild. But a lot of that stuff is also, I mean, especially when we're talking about, oh, the virus was actually created in a military lab in Fort Detrick. I mean, a lot of that stuff is promoted by horribly dishonest actors. You know, and that needs to really be recognized. And we need platforms that can moderate transparently, right? We don't need moderation that takes place through sort of secrecy and in a black box. We need we need moderation that sort of weeds out dishonest, disinformation, right? Like falsities that are purposely put out there, um, without sort of leaving people in the dark about what's happening. and I haven't seen a whole lot of that. I know a lot of people are thinking about it, but I don't I don't think we have that conversation happening yet.
Okay, two things. First of all, the moderation. It's interesting you bring that up, but I think that ultimately points to perhaps why there is such a prevalence of conspiracy theories currently, because there is no trusted source of information that everybody can agree on. So just like the media landscape, for example, is so
Yeah.
fragmented, increasingly so, so too is the idea of truth, that there is this truth is a relative concept now, that everybody has his or her their own version of what is true. And even if we look at moderation and taken quite literally within the presidential debates, for example, it's like a bit like refereeing, where the calls or the decisions or the pronouncements made by a moderator, referee, whoever the trusted source will be, is going to be very politicized and seen as um, unfair
Yeah.
by many parties. Oh, and then going back to what you said about housing or the economic injustices. Essentially, those economic injustices, going back to my opening comments, very much predicated upon uh, racism or skin color oppression, which is a reality that we need to be able to address. And so, I mean, going even back to Tucker Carlson's comments, for example, there is even a debate whether or not what is racism, for example, and whether that even occurs. And now there, of course, the narrative that people are racist against white people, for example, very much again feeds into the self narrative of victimhood that props up the need for a white ethno state, which speaks to the increasing numbers of white nationalists, as well as the reasons for January 6th happening. There are many factors, but one of them, of course, is this idea that there needs to be some type of defense and protection for white people specifically. I'm not talking about every white person has this idea, I'm talking about white nationalists specifically. Their worldview is very much buttressed by this idea of um, white is right and deemed special and needs to be protected, the idea of white supremacy, but then also the idea that there needs to be um, a white ethno state. So the concept of blood, and then soil. There needs to be an actual territorial type of. There needs to be a territory in order to protect uh, the specialness of whiteness itself. So when we think about conspiracy theories, I think that maybe they're often relegated to some type of quote unquote crazy talk, but really what I'm trying to do, and I know your work also addresses that too, is very much we need very much to take these ideas and beliefs seriously, not necessarily don't agree with them, but in terms of empathy and in terms of seeking to understand in what context they develop and why they're believed in and what makes them so powerful and adhered to by so many people. We need to better understand the dynamics of conspiracy theories as well as the other elements of white nationalism, which is why I
Definitely.
wrote the book.
Yeah, no, and
One
it's
of the reasons why
really
I wrote the book.
valuable contribution to the literature for sure. And I was hoping you might read a passage if you can. You're talking, so eloquently about the impacts of white nationalism and its normalization in society. I know you in the book have this alternative that you're putting forth. And I think it's obviously a very bright concept, very useful, and was hoping you might read some of
Okay. Um, let's see here. What passage shall I read? E pluribus unum, recognizing our common humanity. Ours is a crucial period for the homeland security, economic prosperity, and social stability of the United States. The distances across identities, including religious, socioeconomic, and political strata, have never seemed more expansive. The United States has always been replete with contradictions, simultaneously calling for liberty while taking away the freedom of its citizens, espousing equity while minoritizing Black and brown Americans, professing justice while institutionalizing asymmetrical oppression. And at present, the United States is teetering on the precipice of choice between light and dark, constructive and destructive, to empower all equitably or to bestow benefits upon only the few. For the religiously minded, God will judge. For the atheistic or agnostic, history is the ultimate arbiter. It is both a moral imperative and in our collective self-interest to make the choice to benefit from holistic justice, which is for all, rather than to wreak mutually assured destruction by collectively disavowing one another. In the final analysis, it is only by fully recognizing our common humanity that we will be able to strive toward mutual peace and prosperity on this planet we all share.
Awesome. Love it. Totally love it. Yeah. So Annie, you want to open things up?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, write them in the chat. Here's the cat. I said he would show up at some point during the event. Uh, so if anyone has any questions, write them in the chat. Thank you for mentioning at the beginning all of the sort of Minnesota specific references, including the Mapping Prejudice Project, which is very interesting. And if you're from Minnesota, particularly, or from the Twin Cities, definitely recommend looking that up if you haven't heard of it. It is fascinating. So I guess I'll stick with that theme. Just one question from me. So, Sara, what sort of research went into this book, and if anything was specific to us here in Minnesota in terms of your findings about how and why these radical movements are taking root, if there was anything Minnesota specific in your findings?
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie, for that question. Homegrown Hate is the culmination of 10 plus years. I would say actually about 12 years of research and writing extensively. So there's a whole slew of different types of investigative research that went on in terms of interviewing people, in terms of corroborating and exploring first primary literature, for example, so many journals, videos, etc., attending different events, and a lot of groundwork to make sure that I am fully essentially providing the most comprehensive and up-to-date resource on both white nationalism and militant Islamism. With regard to Minneapolis specifically, actually, it's a site currently, as well as has been in the post 9/11 dynamic, of counter-violent extremism programs. So they're known as CVE programs. And as you know well, and as I'm sure your viewers know well, that Minneapolis has a really interesting and dynamic history, so past as well as present, to do with diverse communities, both skin color wise as well as socioeconomically. And what is compelling about Minneapolis specifically is how it is a site of a counter-violent extremism program, so CVE, because it's one of the cities that essentially has become the epicenter of surveilling Muslim Americans in the post 9/11 dynamic, or in the post 9/11 security paradigm, I would say. And now with January 6th, the question remains if our current counterterrorism paradigm can actually understand and equitably address the perils of white nationalism and white nationalist terrorism. Because as we've seen post 9/11, especially as the Muslim Americans who live in Minneapolis will attest to most likely, is that what the CVE program has essentially done is pit Muslim American against Muslim American and Muslim American against non-Muslim American. And so there's been this whole dynamic of criminalization, surveillance, as well as suspicion, because there's this culture of essentially spying, and law enforcement is seen as opposition to the community rather than a resource for the community, and not just the Muslim American community, but for Minneapolis, and also the different agencies as well, from federal, state, and local levels. They essentially create what is called a joint terrorism task force, and all of those facilities are essentially, again, pitted against Americans, rather than seen as being involved with what I call is trying to understand and empathize fully the situation on the ground. And so Minneapolis is very interesting and compelling city, and I think there a lot of the issues that Minneapolis is facing are not specific, unfortunately, to Minneapolis, but really can be seen to represent many of the issues that are creating so much violence within the United States, as well as around the world.
Thank you for that. That was a great answer. I don't see any questions. I just want to remind everyone who's watching that we did put the link to the book at the Majors and Quinn website in the chat, so you can head over there if you're interested in reading more about the book. Majors and Quinn is open for limited browsing, so if you happen to be in the area, we are open 7 days a week. Just head to our website. You can see all of our policies, but we also do curbside pickup and delivery as well. So thank you very much for that. If you choose to shop and purchase Homegrown Hate, thank you so much. Alex and Sara, any final thoughts to take us out?
Do you have any thoughts, Alex? You want to share?
Yeah, sure. I just thank you very much for having me in this program. I really appreciate being here, and it's an honor.
I want to say thank you again to Alex, and thank you so much, Annie. And I appreciate everybody's time. I know it's a time of mental exhaustion, as well as physically taxing time, I would say. But I also think it's very important that we recognize our own histories. So if one identifies with whatever communities one identifies, and not just with skin color, but also gender expression and sexual orientation, etc., to understand how those dynamics, or ability, for example, age as well, how those dynamics come into play within one's own community. So that's why the Mapping Prejudice Project is such a great resource, I think, locally. But then also, remember that everybody is a human being, and so people don't always necessarily recognize that. But I think, as I've said time and again, and as I write in Homegrown Hate, that essentially it's not until we recognize each other as fellow human beings and recognize each other's rights as fellow human beings that we will be able to fully address the systems of oppression that have created so many divisions thus far in the United States. So it's, grassroots movements over time have also shown us that we can do it. So there is hope, and it's really up to us as individuals in order to essentially embody that change that we want to see in our own communities and in the world around us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. To the both of you, that was a fascinating conversation. Thank you both for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, everyone out there watching.
Yeah, best wishes for good health. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.